The sad truth about Victorian living dolls. Have you ever looked at an old Victorian photograph and thought, everything looked so beautiful back then? The elegant dresses, the perfectly curled hair, the grand homes, the delicate porcelain dolls sitting quietly on shelves. From the outside, the Victorian era almost looks like something out of a fairy tale. But the more you learn about it, the more fairy tale begins to fall apart. Behind the lace, ribbons, and polished manners was a world filled with strict rules, impossible expectations, and lives that were often much harder than they appeared. One phrase you'll sometimes hear online is Victorian living dolls. While it wasn't an official historical title, people use it today to describe how some girls, especially in wealthy families, were expected to look and behave almost like beautiful dolls. They were expected to be graceful, quiet, perfectly dressed, and always composed. The goal wasn't just to raise a child. For many families, it was to raise someone who reflected the family's reputation and social status. Imagine waking up every morning knowing that how you looked, how you walked, how you sat, and even how loudly you laughed could be judged by everyone around you. Childhood wasn't always about climbing trees or getting dirty outside. For many girls, it was about learning etiquette. I don't know how to say that, but I'll put it on the screen. But learning how to pour tea correctly, learning how to greet visitors, learning how to sit with perfect posture, learning how to learning how to play music, and above all else, learning how to never embarrass the family. From a very young age, girls were often dressed in carefully chosen clothing that reflected wealth and refinement. Their hair was styled neatly, their manners corrected constantly, and they were taught that appearance mattered enormously. Portraits from the Victorian era show children sitting perfectly still with serious expressions. Today, many people assume they looked unhappy. Sometimes that may have been true, but another reason was practical. Early photography required people to stay still for much longer than modern cameras, making serious expressions easier to hold. Even so, those photographs often captured a culture that valued composure above spontaneity. I don't know how to say that again. A child laughing loudly in public could be viewed as poorly disciplined. Running through the house wasn't considered ladylike. Speaking over adults was unacceptable. Even expressing strong emotions could be discouraged in polite society. The ideal Victorian girl was expected to appear calm, gentle, and self-controlled. It's easy to mistake that for elegance, but never feeling free to simply act your age. Now it's important to remember that not every family lived the same way. The Victorian era lasted for decades, and people's experiences varied depending on where they lived and how much money they had and their families' beliefs. Some children had loving homes, others faced strict discipline, and many working class children lived lives that looked nothing like the glamorous images we see often online. Still, one thing remained common throughout much of society. Girls and women had far fewer rights than they do today. Education was limited for many. Career opportunities were scarce, I don't know. Marriage was often seen as one of the most important goals for a woman's future. Success wasn't measured by independence, it was measured by respectability, by how well someone's fit society, by how some, oh my goodness, by how well someone fit society's expectations. That pressure shaped almost every part of daily life. Even fashion became a symbol of those expectations. The dresses were breathtaking, layers of silk, delicate lace, and intricate embroidery. Okay, I'm cutting that part out. Beautiful hats decorated with ribbons and flowers, but beauty often came at a cost. Many garments were heavy and difficult to move in, as few older girls, some wore corsets that shaped the waist into the fashionable silhouette of the time. Not every woman laced them to dangerous extremes. Despite what popular myths sometimes suggest, but tight lacing did occur and could be uncomfortable or even harmful for some. Fashion wasn't only about self-expression, it was about discipline, looking proper, looking respectful, looking perfect, even if perfection came at the expense of comfort. Looking back today, it's understandable why people romanticize the Victorian era. The clothing is timeless. The tea sets, libraries, gardens, and candle-lit rooms create an atmosphere that feels magical. But history often hides its hardest truths behind its prettiest pictures. And as we continue exploring the lives of these so-called living dolls, we'll discover that behind every beautiful photograph was a real person, with fears, dreams, and a desire for freedom that couldn't always be expressed. Because sometimes the prettiest cages are still cages. Imagine being 8 years old. Instead of spending your afternoon riding your bike, watching TV, or hanging out with your friends, you're being reminded to sit straighter, speak softer, and smile politely. Every move matters, every word is noticed, every mistake could reflect poorly on your family. For many girls in Victorian society, especially those from wealthy households, good manners weren't just encouraged, they were expected. From a young age, girls often received lessons in etiquette and I don't know how to say that. Etiquette? I don't know. The word will be somewhere on the screen, but they will learn how to greet guests, set a formal table, write polite letters, dance, play instruments like the piano, and carry on refined conversations. These skills weren't just hobbies. They were considered essential for becoming a proper lady. Many families believed a girl's character could be judged by the smallest details. Did she interrupt someone? Did she laugh too loudly? Did she slouch? Did she speak before an adult finished talking? Even tiny actions could become lessons in discipline. As girls grow older, the pressure often increased. Society expected them to be modest, graceful, and selfless. They were encouraged to put others first and avoid drawing attention to themselves in ways that were seen as improper. At the same time, they were expected to look beautiful. Fashion magazines of the era promoted the latest styles, and appearance became closely tied to social status. Looking polished suggested that your family had wealth, education, and respectability. Hair was carefully arranged, gloves were worn in public, Dresses were clean despite being difficult to maintain. Everything had to look effortless, even when it wasn't. And then there were the corsets. Today, corsets were often portrayed as unbearable torture devices. The reality is a bit more complicated. Many women wore them as supportive undergarments. I don't know. And not everyone tightened them dramatically. However, some people did practice extreme tight lacing to achieve a very small waist, which could cause discomfort and health problems. If it reflected a larger message, changing your body to fit society's expectations was often seen as normal. The idea may sound surprisingly familiar. Even today, social media can make people feel pressure to chase unrealistic beauty standards. The methods have changed. The pressure hasn't disappeared. Victorian girls also spent their time learning accomplishments that were considered attractive in society. Painting, singing, and piano playing were only enjoyable skills. They were signs that someone came from a refined background. Education itself depending heavily on social class. Girls from wealthy families might have private tutors or attend finishing schools focused on manners, languages, music, and art. Working class girls, however, often had very different lives. Many left school early to help support their families. Some worked long hours in factories. Others became servants in wealthy homes. Some cared for younger siblings while their parents worked, while one girl practiced into a drawing room. Another might have been sewing clothes for hours just to help her family survive. It's one of the biggest misconceptions about the Victorian era. When people picture it today, they often imagine castles, elegant gowns, afternoon tea, and glamorous parties. But those experiences belong to only a smart part of society. Most people worked incredibly hard. Many families struggled with poverty. Children often took on responsibilities far earlier than we would expect today. Even wealthy girls, despite their comfortable surroundings, lived under expectations that limited many of their choices. Marriage was often considered one of the most important milestones in a woman's life. Who you married could shape your future, your financial security, and your family's reputation. That meant young women were often judged not only for their kindness or intelligence, but for how well they matched society's ideal of femininity. It's difficult to imagine carrying that kind of pressure before even reaching adulthood. To always wonder if you were pretty enough, polite enough, quiet enough, perfect enough, and perhaps that's why the image of the living doll feels so haunting today. A doll doesn't speak its mind. A doll doesn't make its own decisions. A doll simply sits where it's placed and looks beautiful. Real girls deserved much more than that. As we'll discover next, beneath the polished manners and elegant dresses was a world filled with grief, illness, and challenges that many people don't associate with the Victorian era at all. When people picture the Victorian era, they often imagine grand ballrooms, elegant tea parties, horse-drawn carriages, and beautiful homes lit by candlelight. But those images only tell part of the story. For many people, everyday life was filled with uncertainty. One of the most challenges was illness. Medicine was improving during the Victorian era, but it was still far from what we know today. Diseases that are now preventable or treatable claimed countless lives. Outbreaks of illnesses like tuberculosis, scarlet fever, and cholera were common, especially in crowded cities where sanitation was poor. For families, losing a child was heartbreakingly common. That reality shaped Victorian culture in ways that can seem unusual today. Families often wore black clothing for long periods after a loved one died. Homes displayed mourning jewelry containing locks of hair, and photographs were sometimes taken to remember family members who had passed away. These customs may seem strange to us now, but they reflected a society where grief was a much more visible part of daily life. Now imagine being a young girl growing up in that world. You're expected to smile politely, behave perfectly, represent your family well, and at the same time, you may have experienced loss at an age where children today are still learning about the world. For girls in wealthy households, emotions were often expected to be expressed with restraint in public. While families grieved deeply, society also placed a high value on composure and self-control. For working-class children, life brought different hardships. Many worked in factories, textile mills, mines, or as domestic servants. The work could be long, repetitive, and physically demanding. Safety standards were limited, and children sometimes worked many hours to help support their families. It's difficult to reconcile these realities with the romantic images we often see online. One child was learning ballroom etiquette, and another was spending long days working. Both lived during the same era. That's why history is rarely as simple as it first appears. The Victorian period was full of beauty but also inequality, full of elegance but also hardship. Even entertainment reflected strict expectations. Young ladies were encouraged to enjoy activities considered respectable, such as reading, drawing, music, and carefully supervised social gatherings. Freedom was often limited by social rules: who you spoke to, how you dressed, where you went. Even your future could be influenced by expectations placed on how long before you were old enough to choose your own path. This is part of why the phrase "living doll" resonates today. It captures the idea of being admired for appearance while having little control over your own life. Of course, it's important not to oversimplify history. Women and girls in the Victorian era had diverse experiences, and many showed resilience, creativity, and determination despite the limits they faced. Some became writers, reformers, educators, artists, and advocates for change. Their stories remind us that even in restrictive societies, people still find ways to make a difference. Perhaps that's the biggest lesson of all. Behind every carefully posed photograph wasn't just a perfectly dressed girl. There was a person, someone with dreams, someone with fears, someone who laughed with friends, someone who cried in private. Someone who hoped for a future that offered more choices than the world around her sometimes allowed. When we look back at history, it's easy to admire the fashion and texture, but it's just as simple to remember the people who lived those lives, because they were never dolls. They were daughters, sisters, friends, and human beings. So, why are we still so fascinated by the Victorian era? Maybe it's the architecture, the candlelit libraries, the handwritten letters, the flower gardens, the elegant gowns, the feeling that life moved more slowly. It's understandable why so many people romanticized that world. In today's fast-paced culture, the Victorian aesthetic can feel peacefully and timeless. But aesthetics and reality aren't always the same thing. A beautiful photograph doesn't tell you about what someone was feeling. A perfectly decorated room doesn't reveal the pressure someone lived under. A gorgeous dress doesn't tell you whether the person wearing it could make her own choices. History has a way of showing us the highlights while hiding the hardships. That's why it's important to look beyond appearances. The idea of the living doll reminds us how dangerous it can be when society values appearance more than individuality. When girls are praised only for being beautiful. When they're expected to stay quiet instead of speaking up. When they're taught that pleasing others matters more than understanding themselves. They can begin to feel like they're performing instead of truly living. Thankfully, the world has changed in many ways. Today, women and girls have opportunities that many Victorians could only dream about. They can pursue careers, higher education, vote, own property in many countries, start businesses, create art, and share their voices with the world. That doesn't mean every challenge has disappeared. Modern beauty standards can still be overwhelming. Social media often encourages perfection. Filters create impossible expectations. Many people still feel pressure to appear flawless instead of authentic. In some ways, the stage has changed, but the performance can feel familiar. That's why stories from history still matter. They remind us where certain ideas came from. They help us appreciate the freedoms people fought to gain. And they encourage us to question the standards we still accept today. Maybe the greatest lesson from the Victorian era isn't about corsets or lace dresses. Maybe it's this. Every generation has its version of the perfect woman. And every generation has people brave enough to challenge that idea. The girls in those old photographs weren't decorations. They were porcelain dolls. They weren't porcelain dolls. They were real people with hopes, fears, talents, and personalities that often stretched far beyond the society expected of them. So the next time you scroll past a beautifully edited Victorian photo online, take a second look. Admire the craftsmanship, appreciate the history, but also remember the human story behind the image. Because every ribbon, every carefully curled strand of hair, every perfectly posed portrait was someone whose life was far more complicated than the photograph could ever show. History isn't just about beautiful things, it's about people, and sometimes the saddest stories are hidden behind the prettiest pictures. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and loved exploring the hidden truths behind history, beauty, and culture, don't forget to subscribe and come back for the next episode. Until next time, remember this. Never mistake perfection for happiness, and never forget that every face in history belonged to a real person with a story worth telling.